Hi everyone, I'm Eleanor. I'm a project assistant at Archaeology Scotland, and the full title of the talk this evening is Prehistoric Pioneers, Celebrating Scotland's Earliest Megalithic Monuments and the Women Who Investigated Them. For anyone not familiar with us, at Archaeology Scotland, we are a nationwide charity working to inspire people to engage with and enjoy heritage in Scotland. We have a huge variety of projects and work with a wide range of audiences. One of these is our Adopt a Monument programme, which supports local communities to conserve their heritage. And this support can range from training and grant application support through to running excavations and on-site activities. And it's through this kind of project that we are delivering the Scotland's Earliest Megalithic Monuments project. At the end of 2024, it was announced that Archaeology Scotland had received an Audry Henshall Legacy Grant from the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland. And through this, we're investigating 3 chambered cairns, one of which Simon knows very, very well, as well as celebrating the legacy of Audry Henshall. We were due to have most of our excavations done by now, but for various unforeseen circumstances that range from getting our permissions and our scheduled monument consent sorted through to really bad weather, these haven't happened yet, and the first is going to be taking place in March. So before I speak any more about the project, I just want to circle back and give a bit of an introduction to the Neolithic. I'm sure it will be common knowledge to some of you, but just so we're all on the same page, and talk a little bit about the monuments themselves. I'll then speak a bit about Audry Henshall and her research and why celebrating her legacy is important. And then finally, I'll talk a bit about our plans, the work we've done so far, and how we're hoping to branch out to explore more prehistoric pioneers and their legacies. So the Neolithic was the time of the first monument builders in Scotland. This is a timeline showing the different periods of prehistory in Scotland, beginning with the Paleolithic through to the Iron Age. And just because I like to always put it in a bit of perspective, this is the Neolithic on another timeline. So here is roughly where Britain becomes an island. Here's the Neolithic and when our monuments are being constructed. And then here is the whole of written history. So the people who built these tombs are further away in time from the Romans in Britain than we are today. The Neolithic lasted from around 4000 to 2500 BC, so that's 1,500 years or about 60 generations. It was a period of huge change. It saw the arrival of farming to Scotland. People cultivated cereals for the first time and began to raise cattle, sheep and pigs, although people still hunted and gathered non-domestic plants as well. This is also the period where people began to make pottery and develop new forms of stone tools. Neolithic people were skilled craftspeople, making everything from like gorgeous polished stone axes to these mysterious carved stone balls. They would have also produced material we don't find in the archaeological record, from carved wooden objects to basketry and textiles. Some people likely began to live more sedentary lives, although there is significant evidence, sort of particularly for the Middle Neolithic, that some people were more mobile still. And throughout this period, people are building monuments. Some are comprised of banks and ditches, enclosing large areas of space, and others were made of just constructions made of wood, earth, and stone. And the most iconic of these monuments, at least for Scotland, are the early Neolithic chambered tombs. So as I said, the Neolithic is this period of huge change, not just from what came before, but sort of constant seasonal, generational changes that can easily be hidden by our uncertainty about dating processes. But what we know about the Neolithic is also constantly changing. So these were just some examples I found from a very quick search for Neolithic Scotland new discoveries or research published in 2025. So you can see how much is constantly changing about what we know about the Neolithic. And then very bluntly, this is how I would choose to split up the Neolithic, sort of following Vicky Cummings's overarching chronology. So for this, the early Neolithic, when I'm talking about that, I mean this period from about 4000 to 3400 BC. So chambered tombs, as we said, I think they're quite iconic. They're one of the best preserved varieties of early Neolithic monuments. Very broadly, they involve the construction of a chamber or multiple chambers using slabs of stone to sort of bluntly create boxes. The chambers were then roofed with a capstone or corbelling where overlapping stones are sort of built up to form a roof. Most of the chambers are quite small, and some may actually have only been accessible from above. Many of these sites were enclosed within a cairn, so covered in stones or a mound of earth. And some of these cairns then made these monuments absolutely huge, making the tombs prominent features in the landscape. And some have multiple phases of use. They're often modified at a later date, and additional passages, potentially additional chambers are added, and the cairn materials extended over that as well sometimes. Some have a kist inserted into the side of the cairn as a later burial, and some of these additions are significantly later on as well. We often find Bronze Age material in these cairns, for example. They're found across the UK and Ireland and the Isle of Man, with significant regional variation. There's lots of subtypes and groups, and the typology of these has been studied and published on extensively. The core groups generally accepted to be early Neolithic are these four here. So the type most relevant to our project and what I'm talking about today are the Clyde cairns, which are found across Western Scotland. Their distribution's focused on Argyll and Bute, but they also appear down to Dumfries and Galloway and up to the Western Isles. And a second Scottish kind of chamber tomb are the stalled cairns, which are found across northern Scotland, so sort of Caithness, Sutherland, Orkney. And then these Clyde cairns are typically trapezoidal in shape, but this shape is formed by the mound rather than the chamber itself. This shape formed by the mound also creates a facade, sometimes involving the placement of further stones to create this shape here. This creates this kind of forecourt area where there would have been much more space for people to gather compared to these chambers where there's very limited space. But it's into these chambers that the bodies of the dead would have been placed. One more regional type worth mentioning here are these Hebridean type cairns. So these are also focused on the west coast. They're generally just sort of round in shape. There's not the evidence for the passages and the chambers. And there's one example from South Uist, and this is kind of what they would look like in plan for that kind of construction. And the dating of these is a little bit more unclear, so you don't always see them discussed for the early Neolithic. And all these tombs sit in a broader context of all the types of burial practice that we have evidence for in Neolithic Britain and Ireland. So we have evidence for a huge variety of practices, and they're hard to assign purely to separate categories, but they range from this burial of intact or articulated bodies, whether that's in a tomb, a grave, a pit, a ditch, through to the bodies that were partly separated, potentially broken down through exposure, deliberate dismemberment, or moved after a primary burial, through to the ones that are fully fragmented, broken down. You're not finding very much beyond little fragments. And there's also evidence for cremation in the Neolithic as well, I should point out, although that becomes more common towards the end of the period. And we can ask whether it meant something different to be buried in a tomb in this kind of context compared to another location, or whether it was the treatment of the body that mattered more. In these monuments, overall, we find the remains of men and women, adults and children. Individual bodies are often commingled, meaning that we sometimes have to estimate the numbers of people buried by occurrences of particular bones rather than having complete skeletons to work with. And this is significant in how we interpret the monuments. So we can sort of ask, was it communal identity being emphasised over the memory of an individual? Did it matter more to be entered into a community of ancestral dead than to be commemorated alone? And these monuments have been referred to in past literature as houses of the dead, potentially offering kind of space for the transformation of the body from an individual to part of a collective deposit. It might also be that these monuments were intended to house the difficult dead. So in several cases through the UK, we find people with things like arrowheads still lodged in their ribs or their pelvis. So we're still finding it in the bone. And that leads us to maybe think, were these people victims of interpersonal violence? But a difficult death could also be those who died of disease before they reached certain milestones, or perhaps they were particularly central to the communities. Or an alternative interpretation of these monuments is that they were a way of claiming land. So by celebrating a group of founding ancestors and staking a claim to a place by building this large monument, the living can then maintain their connection to the land through continued interaction with these monuments. But we are limited in what we can learn about these people, particularly for these Scottish monuments. So our picture for the Neolithic will always be incomplete, but there are some more specific challenges that we have to deal with. So cremated bone survives better in acidic soils, which is what we have, but unfortunately, uncremated bone does not survive very well at all. And this poor bone preservation places some limits on what we can learn about the people who were buried here. It means we often can't compare the treatments of bodies across different sites because we don't have the bodies still remaining. And it gives us major issues for establishing chronology as well. So we can consider different phases of construction from the stones that are left at the sites, but it's difficult to know how far apart in time these may have been or how long they were used for. So for chambered tombs in southern England, radiocarbon dating and Bayesian statistical models have narrowed down the use of these monuments to only a couple of decades in some cases, suggesting it was only 1 or 2 generations buried within them before the monument was sealed and people moved on. But this just isn't possible with the kind of preservation we have in many sites in Scotland, although the caveat with that is some of the amazing preservation we have in the Orcadian tombs. And this also limits how we can apply scientific analysis, which is becoming increasingly common, including aDNA and isotope analysis to look at diet and past mobility. But there is still a lot we can learn from these monuments, or a lot we can speculate about. So they obviously required a huge amount of time and effort in their construction. So we can consider what this can tell us about social organisation. We can look at where they're positioned in the landscape and what this can tell us about people that use that land, or which landscape features might be referenced in their construction. And we can consider the broader connections between regions. So for these types of monuments, it's particularly apparent within the Irish Sea area, where forms of chambered tombs with clear kind of points of similarity are found in Northern Ireland, Southwest Scotland, and the Isle of Man. So this is a site from the Isle of Man. This is Cashel-Lenard. And one thing I find most interesting about these sites is that they're almost always places of continued interaction. So even in places where now they seem really remote, quite often cairn material has been removed and repurposed. They may have been robbed by early nosy people, early archaeologists poking around the large stones. And by the time we get into the 19th and 20th centuries, we have records of investigations starting to appear. And now it's quite common for each kind of generation of archaeologists with new methods, new scientific approaches, new theories to come back and work at these monuments time and time again. And importantly, especially for us at Archaeology Scotland, these monuments also hold significance and huge potential for communities. They can be the oldest evidence for people inhabiting an area, and engaging with these sites can be a great way of bringing people together and sort of getting them to enjoy and want to protect their heritage. So that brings us back onto our Scotland's Earliest Megalithic Monuments project. So for anyone not familiar with Audry Henshall, she was a prominent figure in Scottish archaeology and made significant contributions to our understanding of prehistory. She was born in Oldham in Lancashire in 1927, but moved to Scotland to study archaeology at the University of Edinburgh. And she graduated with her master's in 1949 before returning as a research fellow. The work she's most famous for, as we were discussing when we joined, was the Chambered Tombs of Scotland, which was a big survey of all of the known chambered tomb sites at the time across the country, and it was published in 2 volumes. After completing this, she went on to contribute to 64 publications in 67 years, which is a work ethic that I cannot get my head around. And this included adding significantly to her survey work with further regional volumes, as well as on her other interests in Neolithic and Bronze Age pottery and early textiles. She was later appointed Assistant Secretary to the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland during a period of rapid expansion of Scottish archaeology, and she was made an honorary fellow shortly after her retirement in 1987. She went on to receive an OBE for services to archaeology and the Society's Dorothy Marshall Medal for outstanding contribution to Scottish archaeology. And in 1992, an entire publication called Vessels to the Ancestors was dedicated to her because of her contributions. So while many people within the field of British prehistory are familiar with Henshall, familiar with her work, the level of knowledge about her career overall and the work that went into these publications is, or at least for people of my generation who didn't know her personally, is quite limited. And she also isn't a regularly acknowledged figure when we discuss the history of archaeology. The name recognition, she doesn't come up in the same way as someone like Gordon Childe or Stuart Pigott would. And that's even like not considering recognition beyond the kind of field of archaeology. If you ask someone for the name of an archaeologist on the street, maybe you'll get Howard Carter, but you're probably going to get Indiana Jones. So the Chamber Tombs of Scotland, the survey that went behind this and then the eventual publication took 21 years. She began work on the study in 1951. The two volumes together make up over 1,000 pages, and within that are records of 595 tombs. And this is not even counting the kind of third volume that she did later as an update. So this work took up her weekends and holidays for decades, and the National Museum gave her a year leave in the end to complete the second volume to get it over the line. And as we know already, there's people here who have encountered these volumes. They're still an essential reference text, and absolutely outrageously, they're not digitised as far as I know. If they are digitised, please let me know. And they're out of print. So having a copy of this is gold dust. It's criminally not readily available to people, given how much we still rely on it. So an important part of our work with the Legacy Grant is to expand on what Henshall was able to tell us about these sites. So at the start of the process, we identified 8 possible examples of these early Neolithic monuments, which are all on the screen here. These sites are all those without secure dating evidence or ones where we've still got questions to be answered. And we are planning to conduct fieldwork on these 3 sites. So we have 1 on South Uist and 2 in Argyll and Bute. Achnacaribeg and Leval have been excavated before by Graham Ritchie and Vicky Cummings and Niall Sharples, most recently respectively. And we'll be conducting small trench excavations to try and confirm the phasing of these sites and hopefully, fingers crossed for us, find some material for radiocarbon dating. There's potential for surviving lithics, possibly pottery fragments or bone, but nothing diagnostics come from some of these recent excavations. So we'll probably be relying quite heavily on soil sampling for flotation and get some datable material down that avenue. And this will be with people from the local community. So we're hoping to offer a bit of archaeological skills training and raise awareness and knowledge of the sites locally, and hopefully protect them into the future through that as well. So in addition to that work that's coming up, we also wanted to think about this aspect of the project, which is the legacy celebration. And this is a lot of what I've been working on so far. So we've tied in this to our theme for Adopt Monument this year, which is Prehistoric Pioneers. So while Henshall's work and career were an exceptional contribution, she's not exceptional in her existence as a woman in archaeology. And through these projects on the West Coast, as well as other Adopt Monument projects we've got ongoing, we're aiming to kind of shine a light on 3 more women who were working in Scottish archaeology around the same time. So the first of these is Dorothy Marshall, who again, some people may be familiar with. She's an archaeologist from the Isle of Bute who excavated several Neolithic and Bronze Age sites. She was born in 1900 as the youngest daughter of Dr. John Nairn Marshall, who was a GP on Bute and himself was a keen naturalist archaeologist. Dorothy studied archaeology at the Institute of Archaeology in London and went on to take part in excavations in the East Mediterranean, including in Cyprus and at Jericho, where she worked as a finds recorder for Kathleen Kenyon, who's another very prominent woman in archaeology at this time. Marshall then returns to Bute, where she worked with the museum and was a key supporter of the local Cowell Archaeological Society, as well as the Scottish regional group of the Council for British Archaeology, which then becomes Council for Scottish Archaeology and then Archaeology Scotland. Marshall was a key figure in multiple excavations in the region, including Hayley Chambered Cairn, which is one of our Adopt Monument sites from several years ago, as well as leading the excavations at Ochagan, which is a multi-period settlement site near Glendaruel in Argyll, which will come up again later on. Also working in Argyll was Marion Campbell. So she collected a huge body of information about archaeological sites in mid-Argyll in the 50s and 60s. She conducted one survey over a period of 10 years alongside Mary Sandeman, and the survey included the amazing archaeology at Kilmartin Glen, which is pictured here. She was also a supporter of local heritage, worked to support the Auchendrane Township Museum, as well as donating her collection of antiquities to the Kilmartin Museum, who have a library named after her now, which is lovely. And finally, we have Betty Rennie. She was born in 1920 in Glasgow before moving to the Cowal Peninsula. During the Second World War, she got a job at children's nursery and then went on to work as a primary school teacher until her retirement. In her spare time and after she retired, she was a dedicated archaeologist. She pulled together a gazetteer of archaeological sites on the Cowal Shore, as well as a large body of local research and surveying, particularly of these kind of burnt platforms that I'm sure some people are familiar with. She was a founding member of the Cowal Archaeological and Historical Society, and she was awarded an MBE for services to archaeology in Argyll. And like Audry Henshall, she received the Dorothy Marshall Medal for her voluntary contributions to archaeology in Scotland. But why do we need to celebrate women in archaeology? Women are very well represented now in UK archaeology. The Profiling the Profession, which is sort of archaeology-wide survey, most recently done in 2020, published in 2021, shows that the rates of women in archaeology is in line with the overall UK workforce. And in fact, in the 20 to 24 age bracket, they're the majority. They make up 75% of the workforce. But these statistics on their own disguise deeper issues. And while work is being done by organisations like CIFA to make changes, these are much harder to resolve without more broad societal change. So women have issues with progression in the field, which has been shown in multiple studies, most recently Pope and Tether last year, 2025. And these all show that there's a significant drop-off in numbers of women in higher roles, particularly high-level academic jobs. And misogyny remains an issue in archaeology. Anecdotally, we know that preconceptions about what it means to be a woman in the field still remain. And again, these Profiling the Profession statistics show that archaeology can be a hostile working environment. So they report that 74% of UK archaeologists have witnessed bullying or harassment, and for 32% of that is behaviour of a sexual nature, and 30% have noted inappropriate comments on appearance. And while there was no specific data about gender-based harassment and things like that, or gender-based discrimination, we can kind of see how that forms part of these statistics. And gender also intersects with other ways in which we lack diversity in the field of archaeology. So white people, particularly those from middle class and upper class backgrounds, are overrepresented in archaeology compared to their non-white or working class counterparts. So we can see from these statistics that 97% of UK archaeologists are white compared to a much smaller proportion, 82% of the wider population. And these numbers also tell us that we're missing a huge amount of talent, and we need to think more about how we can remove obstacles to entering the field for these people. So why tell women's stories? What's that going to do? How is that going to help? A huge element of what we're trying to change with something like this is public perception. So as we mentioned earlier, the names of these women we've spoken about aren't necessarily those that we know well or have easy access to information about. A number of initiatives already from the last nearly 15 years now have picked up on this issue. So the first is the Trailblazers, which was established in 2013 by 4 early career researchers, not just from archaeology, but from paleontology or geology, those kind of fields as well. So this came from a frustration with how women's contributions to their field don't get the same mainstream attention as their counterparts. And through this programme, they share stories via social media and blog posts to raise awareness of these women, share these stories. And the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland have also recently set up the Hidden Voices project to establish and improve Wikipedia entries for women in Scottish archaeology. Because there's this kind of uniting idea that if you see it, you can be it. And young people are an essential target audience. We want to raise the aspirations, bring on the next generation of archaeologists. But as we've seen from our prehistoric pioneers, you can come to archaeology and become an expert at any age. And then so for the last few minutes, I just want to talk a bit about the legacy work we've done so far. So we began by exploring Audry Henshall's legacy in Ardnamurchan. So Archaeology Scotland has long-term involvement in the area, as Phil Richardson, who some of you may have met, he's our project manager. He's also co-director of the Ardnamurchan Transitions Project, alongside Professors Hannah Cobb and Ollie Harris from the Universities of Manchester and Leicester. The project began back in 2006 with an excavation at Clyde Andrus, which is pictured here. It's a chambered cairn in Sordell Bay, and this dig that launched the project was a direct result of Phil and Hannah having looked at the record created by Audry Henshall. In the following years, the project has returned and worked on other sites in the area, including famously the Viking boat burial, and it's trained hundreds of students in archaeological excavation. Clyde Andrus was also included as part of the Bay in the Wander West Heritage Trail and the Real Wild West Adopt a Monument project, so we also have history of coming back here lots of times. I visited the project this summer to discuss its origins, and we also took the opportunity to add to the record of sites in the area. So we produced a new survey of a possible Neolithic tomb called Ericsson's Cairn. The site wasn't recorded by Audry Henshall. It was only found in 2014 when a member of the Ardnamurchan History and Heritage Association spotted it when he was walking his dog. The group then created an initial record, which we've been back over, double-checked the condition, and we've built upon it with some photogrammetry. And importantly, for reflecting on the project, we did this as an all-female team. So it was myself, Hannah Cobb, who's the Professor of Archaeology and Pedagogy at the University of Manchester, Katie Sanderson, who's a commercial archaeologist who first trained on the Ardnamurchan Transitions Project as a student, and Penny Horner of the Ardnamurchan Society. We were able to model sections of the site after clearing the vegetation. So you can see these two upstanding stones here on a little screenshot of the model we've got. And so we've sort of added to the record there, used new techniques we've got, and been able to carry on that legacy of work on that site, potentially starting the route to do a little bit more work there in the future. And thanks to the generosity of people we've worked with, we're also capturing more people's responses and experiences through interviews. So we want to talk about women in archaeology then with women in archaeology now, and especially those with links to pioneering archaeologists who've worked at the same site or in the same area before them. So we spoke to Hannah Cobb at Clyde Andrus, and I was also able to speak to Debbie Kirby, who leads the community group on another of our Adopt a Monument projects. This group are investigating a site at Stronophian Community Forest near Glendaruel in Argyll. And they're incredibly lucky there because within the same landscape as the remains they're investigating, they also have a cup and ring marked stone, a chambered cairn at the top of the hill that was recorded by Audry Henshall, and they have Ochagan, which is the multi-phase settlement site excavated by Dorothy Marshall. And this kind of practice is letting us get a wider variety of voices as well as to explore these connections. And we're hopefully connecting these people who are working on the sites today with their place in this ongoing story and their role in shaping the narratives around these sites. You don't have to be a world-leading expert to be an active part in the history of these places. You're not just an observer to it. And our future plans, dig, hopefully. Watch this space. Pending any major disasters, this will all be kicking off from about mid-March. But we're also hoping to crowdsource some more stories about the women that I've spoken about in this talk and others. So if you have any pictures, memories of people you'd like to celebrate, we'd love to hear from you. For now, our focus is on the West Coast, but we'd really love to explore more avenues to continue this project, even if it's in a slightly different form. So if you have anyone you feel strongly about, please do let us know. We're looking to explore stories of these people, the experiences of these people, and the connections between them, because this isn't just about individuals or holding up single heroes. It's just as much about celebrating and building new networks of people. And these kind of storytelling, we hope, can be another avenue to sparking interest in archaeology, in these monuments, in these places, and to let people make their own connections with people that came before them. So you can follow the project through our blog posts, which are on our website, and they're also shared via our social media. As we get into the excavations, we're hoping we'll be updating things through there as well. If you want to find out more about the Neolithic monuments, I can highly recommend a talk by Dr. Alison Sheridan, focusing on the archaeology of these sites, which is available on the Archaeology Scotland YouTube. Some of you may have already seen it. And for more stories of pioneering women in archaeology, I can recommend checking out the Trailblazers initiative on their website or on social media. And if you want to support our work, you can become a member, you can sign up to our free newsletter. And I just want to say thank you to our funders, all the amazing people who've contributed to the project so far, and our other Archaeology Scotland staff who couldn't be here tonight but have worked very hard on the project. And thank you for inviting me to share this.